South Africa's central bank is planning a major overhaul of its cash system. A report by Bloomberg suggests that it could be the largest in decades. The government says it is aimed at making cash access cheaper, safer, and more accessible for low-income and rural communities.
In South Africa, where local media is reporting that a high-level meeting involving top banking executives and the country's finance minister over potential U.S. sanctions is taking place, or rather took place. Now, Sowetan, which is a daily newspaper, said that their conversation focused on an American bill that, of course, is targeting African National Congress leaders over South Africa's ties with Russia and China.
South Africa's central bank is planning a major overhaul of its cash system. A report by Bloomberg suggests that it could be the largest in decades. The government says it is aimed at making cash access cheaper, safer, and more accessible for low-income and rural communities.
Something fundamental just broke inside the global financial system, and it didn't happen where most people were looking. There was no market crash alert, no emergency press conference, no dramatic announcement on primetime television. Yet quietly, decisively, a line was crossed that may change how money moves, who controls it, and who no longer does. For decades, financial power flowed through familiar channels. Invisible, trusted, unquestioned. Payments moved because permission existed. Transactions cleared because systems allowed them to. Influence wasn't enforced with force, it was embedded in infrastructure. But that infrastructure is no longer untouchable, and the moment it stopped being untouchable, everything changed. What makes this moment different isn't just resistance, it's replacement. Not a protest against the system, a decision to build around it. For years, financial influence worked because there were no real alternatives. Global payments depended on a narrow network of rails designed long ago, governed elsewhere, and accepted as inevitable. That inevitability is now gone. A new path is being laid quietly, deliberately, and with long-term consequences that reach far beyond banking. This is not about symbolism, it's about control. Control over transactions, over data, over settlement, over who decides when money moves and when it doesn't. And when that control shifts, power follows slowly at first, then all at once. Behind the scenes, confidence in old systems has been eroding for years. Sanctions turned finance into a weapon, compliance turned access into a privilege, risk calculations changed. Governments and institutions began asking questions they had never asked before. What happens if access is restricted? What happens if policy overrides commerce? What happens if dependence becomes vulnerability? Those questions don't stay theoretical forever. At some point, they demand answers, and the answer, increasingly, is independence. Building a domestic payment system is not a technical decision, it is a strategic one. It requires trust, infrastructure, coordination, and political will. It signals preparation for a world where access is conditional and influence is contested. It says the future will not be negotiated transaction by transaction, but engineered system by system. This is why the shift matters. Because once payments move through new rails, old leverage weakens. Once settlement happens outside familiar networks, oversight changes. Once trust migrates, it rarely returns. Financial gravity is powerful, but it is not permanent. The collapse isn't loud, its structural influence collapses when it no longer shapes behavior. When alternatives exist, pressure loses force. When compliance is optional, dominance fades. This is the stage the world is entering now, where financial alignment is no longer automatic, and infrastructure determines allegiance more than diplomacy. What makes this development especially disruptive is its timing. Global finance is already under strain. Digital currencies are challenging traditional models. Regional payment networks are expanding. Trust in centralized systems is being questioned by states and institutions alike. In this environment, a move toward autonomy doesn't look radical, it looks inevitable, and inevitability spreads. Once one system proves viable, others take notice. Risk assessments change. Feasibility becomes precedent, and suddenly, what once seemed impossible becomes practical. This is how financial revolutions happen, not through rebellion, but through replication. The narrative often focuses on who applies pressure, but real power lies with those who can ignore it. And ignoring pressure becomes easier when the infrastructure that enables pressure is no longer essential. This shift also reframes sovereignty in the modern age. Borders no longer define control, systems do. Whoever owns the rails owns the flow. Whoever owns the flow shapes outcomes. Payments are no longer just economic tools. They are instruments of policy, security, and influence. That realization is driving a global rethink. What we are witnessing is not isolation, but insulation. not withdrawal but redesign, a move to ensure that domestic commerce, regional trade, and strategic transactions can function regardless of external decisions, that resilience is the new currency of power. Critically, this is not a rejection of global finance, it is a rejection of dependence. Participation remains, but on different terms. Integration continues, but with safeguards. The goal is not to exit the system, but to prevent being trapped by it, and that distinction matters, because systems built for resilience tend to outlast systems built for dominance. Flexibility beats rigidity, optionality beats control, and once enough actors adopt that logic, the entire architecture of influence shifts. The ripple effects extend beyond banking, trade negotiations change, investment strategies adapt, currency relationships evolve, data sovereignty becomes central, even diplomacy adjusts, because leverage works differently when financial pressure no longer guarantees compliance. This is why the word collapse fits, not because everything falls apart, but because something essential stops working the way it used to. Influence that relied on inevitability now faces choice, power that depended on monopoly now faces competition, and competition changes everything. The most telling aspect of this shift is how quietly it's happening. No victory speeches, no declarations of financial war, just construction, just planning, just systems being built, tested, and prepared for scale. By the time the world notices, the transition will already be functional. History shows that the most durable changes rarely announce themselves. They embed themselves, they normalize, and then one day, they are simply how things work. This is one of those changes. A payment system is not just software. It is a statement about the future, about who decides, about who depends on whom, about how much risk a nation is willing to carry and how much it intends to remove. As this new system takes shape, it sends a clear message without saying a word. Financial influence is no longer absolute. It must now compete, it must now adapt, and it must now accept that control can be engineered away. The collapse then is not sudden, but it is real, and once financial power stops being invisible, stops being assumed, stops being automatic, it enters a new phase. One where persuasion replaces pressure, where partnership replaces control, and where systems not slogans determine who holds the future. This is not the end of global finance. It is the end of unquestioned financial dominance, and the world that replaces it will look very different from the one we thought was permanent. Once the initial decision is made, the real transformation begins far from public view. Payment systems do not change overnight. They are engineered quietly, tested patiently, and rolled out strategically, and that process reveals something most observers miss. This is not a reaction to pressure, but preparation for a different future. Because influence only collapses when alternatives work. Behind the scenes, financial planners have been reassessing risk in a world where money has become a political instrument. Every sanction, every restriction, every compliance escalation sent a message that access was conditional. That message lingered. It forced a recalculation of what security really means in modern economics. Security is no longer about reserves alone, it is about continuity. The ability to transact during crisis, to settle obligations without delays, to keep trade flowing even when relationships strain. When money movement becomes uncertain, commerce hesitates, investment retreats, and growth slows. No country can afford that vulnerability indefinitely. This is why infrastructure matters more than statements. Building an independent payment system is a declaration of intent made through architecture rather than rhetoric. It shifts decision-making from external approval to internal capability. It changes the question from will access be granted to is the system operational? That distinction reshapes leverage instantly. Once transactions can be processed domestically, oversight changes. Data no longer flows outward by default. Settlement cycles shorten. Exposure to external freezes diminishes. Even the psychology of negotiation shifts because dependence quietly evaporates. What makes this moment especially significant is that it doesn't stand alone. It connects to a broader pattern unfolding across the global south and beyond. Financial autonomy is no longer viewed as radical, it is viewed as prudent. Systems once assumed permanent are now seen as optional components of a larger, more diversified strategy. Diversification is the real driver here, not isolation, not confrontation, but redundancy. Redundancy is how systems survive shocks, and the modern global economy is entering an era of constant shock. Supply chains fracture, alliances strain, technology evolves faster than regulation. In this environment, reliance on a single financial backbone becomes an unacceptable risk. As alternative systems mature, they don't replace global networks outright, they coexist, but coexistence alone weakens monopoly power. The moment there is a choice, influence must be earned rather than assumed. This is where collapse becomes visible not as a crash, but as erosion. Influence erodes when it can no longer compel behavior, when compliance becomes negotiable, when pressure loses certainty. That erosion spreads quietly because no one announces it. It simply shows up in changed decisions, altered contracts, and recalibrated partnerships. The implications extend beyond payments. Trade settlement begins to diversify, regional commerce strengthens. Cross-border partnerships are redesigned around new rails. Even currency usage adapts as confidence grows in alternative systems. None of this happens dramatically, but all of it compounds. Financial gravity shifts slowly, then suddenly. And once that shift begins, reversing it is extraordinarily difficult. Infrastructure locks in behavior. Behavior shapes policy. Policy solidifies strategy. By the time opposition reacts, the ecosystem has already formed. What's particularly notable is how this development reframes the idea of influence itself. True power is no longer about control, it is about indispensability. Systems that others rely on voluntarily endure. Systems that rely on enforcement eventually fracture. This is the uncomfortable truth now emerging. Financial dominance worked best when it was invisible, when participation felt natural rather than enforced. But as enforcement became visible, trust thinned. And when trust thins, systems look for exits. The construction of alternatives is that exit, not a dramatic escape but a gradual redirection. As domestic capacity grows, confidence grows with it. Financial institutions adapt, businesses adjust their workflows, government agencies integrate new standards. The system stops being experimental and starts being routine. At that point, the shift becomes irreversible. This also changes internal dynamics. Policy choices expand, negotiating positions strengthen, external pressure becomes one factor among many, not the deciding force. Sovereignty, once abstract, becomes operational, and operational sovereignty is powerful. It means decisions are made based on national priorities rather than external thresholds. It means timelines are set internally. It means trade-offs are evaluated without fear of sudden disconnection. That autonomy doesn't eliminate risk, but it redistributes it. For the global system, this marks a transition away from centralized control toward a more fragmented, multipolar financial landscape. Some see fragmentation as instability. Others see it as resilience. The truth is both, and the balance depends on how well systems integrate. Without dominating, what cannot be ignored is momentum. Once one country proves that financial independence is achievable without collapse, the psychological barrier breaks. Others observe, others plan, others begin quietly preparing their own alternatives. The logic spreads because the incentive is universal. No one wants to be vulnerable by design. This is how global structures change, not through grand announcements, but through accumulated decisions driven by risk management. Each new system makes the next easier. Each successful transaction validates the model, and each validation weakens the assumption that the old way is the only way. As this process unfolds, influence must adapt or diminish. Pressure tactics lose reliability. Financial persuasion becomes more transactional. Power becomes situational rather than absolute, and the global financial order begins to resemble the geopolitical one: fluid, contested, and constantly renegotiated. This is the real shift taking place. Not a rejection of cooperation, but a rejection of asymmetry. The future of finance is being shaped by those who understand that control over money movement equals control over outcomes, and that control no longer belongs exclusively to any single system or ideology. It belongs to those willing to build, invest, and commit to long-term autonomy, which brings us to the larger meaning of this moment. This is not a financial rebellion, it is a strategic evolution. A recognition that the rules of influence have changed and that surviving the next era requires systems designed for uncertainty, not obedience. The collapse, then, is not sudden, it is structural. Influence collapses when it can no longer dictate, when it must negotiate, when it must compete, and once competition enters the equation. Dominance becomes fragile. The world is not witnessing the end of global finance, it is witnessing the end of unquestioned financial control. And as new systems quietly take root, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The future will not belong to those who manage access, but to those who can operate without asking for it. That is the shift underway, that is the signal being sent, and once systems begin speaking louder than power, the global balance changes not with noise, but with permanence.